So this is a photograph that I had taken on the location, and I blew it up a little bit. Um, I have several of them. They all kind of look the same, bunch of rocks. But here I've moved over to the left side of the painting, kind of mainly because I don't want to be putting my arm and hand into the areas that I'm going to be working. And my rocks, one thing I notice about them, I'll look at the reference material and then I'll go back to the painting and I'll notice that mine are considerably less angular. They're not quite as rugged looking as those jetty rocks. And so that's something I'll probably try to improve on a little bit, just because I do want them to look, kind of like the rocks that you see at the beach. And these are a little too soft, at least at this point. So I've got to do more shading. It's got to be more faceting to these. And that just takes more steps, just more layers, and understanding the light and shade and where it's hitting them. So if you soften everything up, they're going to start looking like big potatoes rather than rocks. This process of the rocks, it's like any other object, really. You just I typically start with the lightest value, and then I work around, and as that paint dries, I come back with a slightly darker one, and typically change the values on my brush frequently. I'll add little touches of various colors, either warm or cool, depending on if I'm working on the light or the shade. I also do quite a bit of dragging my brush dry across the paper to create a texture, a dry brush effect. Like for here in the shaded area, I've got a little crimson with brown, and that's pretty effective in shadow. Adding a little bit of a real dark brown with a little bit of crimson, or maybe even some Prussian blue mixed in with it, tends to push it back. You will also kind of get a little bit of a violet, which works well in the shadows and tends to recede quite a bit. So I don't want to be too colorful, because these are moss covered rocks, but it does work, and it's kind of something that can be toned down later if you decide there's just too much excitement there in terms of color. It doesn't make sense or something. But I'm kind of I kind of lean toward more color rather than less, and I enjoy it. So looking at what's ahead of me here, the sketch just kind of roughly delineates the shapes, but I don't have anything shaded. I don't like a lot of pencil on the watercolor paper, because pencil kind of gets into the mix. And if you paint over pencil and then you have it underneath your color, it sometimes shows through, and you can't get rid of it. You can't, after there's paint on there, you can't really erase. And I wouldn't want to. That really disturbs the paper if you start grinding away with an eraser. So I tend to have very little drawing. I got to do the drawing with the brush. So I'm keeping an eye on that reference material, but I deviate from it quite a bit as I go further and further along. You just, after you've done a few rocks, essentially the technique you want to use, and in time here, we'll kind of speed up the process slightly by identifying some of the lighter values. And also, one thing that worked for me was to use a little bit of masking fluid and kind of drag that across in places, and then do a light value wash over the top of it, let that dry, remove the masking fluid, and that creates some light spots and some textures. And you can approach this a couple different ways. You can either attack your dark areas first, and then kind of soften those up as you go, and then or you can go from the light to dark. And I did a little bit of both, really. You have to be aware of the what the paper's doing. If the paper's too damp, gonna have to be patient and stay out of it. And if it's really dry, then you're going to leave some very distinct accents or highlights. So you got to be aware of that too. So timing is important, and as always with watercolor, you just can't walk off and leave it until you're satisfied with what's on the paper, because when you come back, you might see some changes that you weren't expecting. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to speed up the video because it's quite long. I mean, this takes forever. And I will be playing some music. It's once again my buddy Jim Brandt, who has written and composed, or written and performed all of the music that I've been using on this. And so it's one of those. And I'll be picking up again if I change technique or I get into something different, which I probably will when I get down to the water line. I'll have some things to say about that and a little more discussion, but otherwise I'm just going to press on, and hopefully you'll enjoy watching the process, watching this whole thing develop. So right now I'm in water mode, and I've got some masking fluid down here just to protect the boat, just the very end on the transom there. And some of those other areas are looking kind of spotty. Those are going to be shells beneath the water, and so they're just some light spots. You can't really distinguish what they represent, but it should be apparent by the time I get done with this thing that's what it is. And then keeping the water, keeping this pretty damp because I don't want any hard edges, so I'm just starting to put in a few washes and building up. And keeping an eye on the rocks to, it's sort of a mirrored image, but in the water is going to be darker than the rocks above the surface. And for that, I'm going to have to apply several washes. I'm not trying to be perfect in terms of where the shadows occur, but I want the feeling to be that this is definitely a reflection, and there's a lot that goes into that. I think primarily what I want to do to keep it, looking like it is a reflection is, for one, keeping a very wet application here. Kind of everything's sort of blurry. There really aren't any extremely hard-edged lines here. And I've already protected some of the white that I want to retain. So I'm going ahead with my next value, which is kind of an olive green, but very dilute. However, can also work the other way around, like I did with the rocks themselves. Sometimes you can start dark and then just let it bleed out. But the key to all of it is how you apply your water to begin with. I mean, the water wetting the paper, because if you do that carefully, the application of the pigment just is a lot easier. I don't just wet the entire surface. I will actually kind of paint with just clear water in a fashion that represents what I'm trying to depict. I don't use big brushes or big sweeping motions because that's not apparent in the rocks above the ground or above the surface there. So what I want to do is sort of put the water down the way I'm going to be painting. And it'll even sometimes look like a brush stroke if you just touch the little puddle that you've created and let the paint spread out to its perimeter, and you'll see how you applied that bit of water, if that makes any sense. I'm trying to kind of constrain where the water goes so that it doesn't look unnatural. I don't want to work against what I've already achieved here. I've got a little light sketch of where the shadows occur in these rocks, but I can also just kind of look above to see, what is there and how should I deal with it. So anyway, it's going to be a progression where I work up several layers and end up with a reflection that's darker than the actual objects there that are being reflected. So that's going to take probably 3 or 4 different periods where I'll apply color and then allow that to dry, and then I'll work over the top of it. Now, by allowing that to dry, I'm still avoiding any super hard edges as it dries, but it does set in to the point where you can do a wash over the top of what's beneath, and they're not just going to blend and obscure everything. You're going to retain the shapes that you put down initially. Like when I'm doing right here, should be evident, even though there will be subsequent layers going above it. You should be able to see that the brush strokes, the shapes that are there. And some of them will probably be going away with the darker applications of color, but most of it, you should get a sense of it at least. And in many cases, you'll be able to see these shapes through the other colors that are going on top of them. So that's a slow process, but reflections are fun in watercolor. This is something I like to do, and it's it's a process like the rest of the painting that involves layers, and occasionally I'll hit on something that I just really like, and I have to recognize that it's what I want, and I leave it alone, because there's a tendency to doing something like this to overpaint. You can just put layer, layer, layer on here and end up with mud. So you have to be, you have to have some restraint. Step away every now and then. Take a look, take a break. I take a lot of them, and come back to it and look at it with a fresh viewpoint, and it'll help you a lot. Look at it from a distance too. We get so close to our work, you kind of have your nose in it, and then that sort of affects your perception as well. So it's nice to step back, assess what you've done, and say, oh well, that part, it'll jump out at you, the parts that you don't particularly care for, or something that needs attention. At least it does for me. And usually that occurs after I've stepped away. So I'm going to step away now. I'm going to speed all this up, and more music from my man, Jim Brandt. And I would encourage you to check him out. He plays in a group called Mojo Cannon, which is an R&B group, and they play around the Northwest. They're awesome. They were the Curtis Hammond Band, and then they morphed into Mojo Cannon. They've got horns, and they play really cool R&B kind of deep track stuff. It's not just the songs that you always hear representing R&B. These are more lesser known stuff that they do a great job of, great arrangements. Anyway, take a look. You might find Mojo Cannon coming to your area, and I would go. They're really cool. All right. Thanks, and I'll see you on the next video, which moves me to the boat. And I've just barely sketched that in, but that'll be after the water here and the beach and the rest of these rocks.